What does it mean to be a citizen of the United States? What rights should citizens be given? And what role does the federal government have in protecting those rights? Do states have more power over the federal government? These are questions that were left unresolved in the time period that we are studying, Reconstruction. As I'm recording this in 2021, a major social movement called Black Lives Matter is occurring in the United States. Those who are advocating for this movement and protesting in the streets are claiming that their civil rights and civil liberties are not being protected by the federal government, and they are falling victim to police brutality and other forms of structural racism, such as like housing or healthcare, things like that. There is a large population in the United States who views this and disagrees and says that it's not happening. And the race card is being played too much. Given this climate that we are in right now, where we see protests in the streets on one side and then calls for law and order on the other, there's a lot of confusion that may occur. What's going on? How do I know what's right? When I look at the news, how do I know if they're telling me the truth or not? Understanding history is one of the most important tools that you have, aside from critical thinking, of course, that could give you an understanding and context, most importantly, for what's happening today. So let's do that. Let's give you some historical context for the issues that are happening right now by analyzing Reconstruction. The era of Reconstruction from 1864 to 1877 is so often just skipped in history classes. It's either lumped in with the Civil War or it's lumped in with civil rights in the 1960s. It's never really just studied openly. And I think, given the current events that are happening right now, it's every American's responsibility to, take a look back and view this history for what it is and identify any common enduring issues or trends that you may be seeing, any causational relationships, any comparable relationships, or continuities or changes over time that stick out to you may give you the context you need to better understand what's happening now. So let's do that. With that said, let's go into the content. The AP College Board wants you to know one key concept about this time period. And I think this time period, or this key concept, is all encompassing for what we need to learn. So I'm going to read right from there. Quote, the Union victory in the Civil War and the contested Reconstruction of the South settled the issues of slavery and secession. End quote. Let's pause there. Slavery, yeah, we know the 13th Amendment ended slavery in 1864. So yeah, that's kind of resolved. And secession, and not, I said kind of, because as we will get in, slavery is not fully resolved, it just evolves. But nonetheless, let's continue. And secession, yeah, I mean, we don't want to go through the Civil War again, so the federal government makes it clear that secession is illegal and states cannot just break away from the Union. So the Civil War and Reconstruction kind of solidified that there's no such thing as legal slavery anymore, right? African Americans have civil rights. The chattel part of slavery is gone. And states cannot just simply leave the Union. However, the College Board is going to talk about two major problems that still existed because Reconstruction failed. So let's continue. Quote, Reconstruction left unresolved many questions about the power of the federal government and citizenship rights. I want you to write those two things down or keep them in the back of your head, because the power of the federal government versus state governments, which has already been just a major issue since the beginning of this country, still is unresolved. And then citizenship rights. an entire population of formerly enslaved Americans are now free legally, and they're given civil rights by the federal government. But citizenship rights are not fully recognized for them in this era. So this is what kind of causes that division. So you got those two, right? You have federal government and citizenship rights. Okay, so now we're going to go into the content. And I want to let you know where my information is coming from, because I'm going to be giving you a lot of quotes and historical data. A lot of the data was compiled by Carol Anderson. Okay, she's a historian. She published a book in 2016 called White Rage. And this is mostly from her first chapter, Reconstructing Reconstruction, pages 7 to 38. Her main thesis in this book, and in particular this chapter, is that whenever black advancement, whether it's through economics or politics or culture or social structure, whenever the black community in the United States advances and tries to at least gain their civil rights or move up the social ladder, there is a response, or she uses the word rage, from the white community and the white controlled institutions to punish and push back and roll back those rights. And she traces this history beginning at the start of Reconstruction. And you could agree or disagree with this perspective. I am just simply delivering this point of view to you. She has been annotating her sources. I have quotes and everything. So we're going to go in and study the events of Reconstruction from that point of view. A newly freed, formerly enslaved African American population in the United States working hard to advance from having nothing to trying to become citizens, right? This is their advancement they're trying to make. She argues that with the failure of Reconstruction, with the failure of the federal government, and the failure of citizenship rights, that advancement was pushed back. So we are going to look at this story about how gains were made, but they were pushed backwards. So let's start right at the beginning with the Civil War, everybody. So the Civil War started in 1861 and it ended in 1865. I just want to tell you, this war was absolutely brutal. It was by far the most destructive war our country has ever fought because both sides were Americans, right? Every casualty you see in this war is an American, even, North and South. And just from the Southern point of view, because Reconstruction mostly happens in the South, 20%, 20% of the entire white Southern population, well, mostly men, right, were killed. Now, that's not including wounded. That's not including Southerners, white Southerners who came with, with missing arms or legs or body parts, right? 20% are just dead. Just think about what that does to a community. If you take 20% of the men in your town or your little family circle and just kill them off, what does that do? That leaves such a gap, doesn't it? This left a serious sense of dread, loss, pain, and anger among white Southerners. So when we study Reconstruction and this white rage, we need to know that a lot of this not only is fueled by racism, but it's fueled by what just happened, right? So many people lost loved ones in this war. The loss is real, the loss is serious, and it's palpable if you've ever lost somebody, right? So just thinking from that point of view, I often compare it to, when we talk about the rise of the Nazis after World War I. Many of the people who later supported the Nazi government were shaken by the trauma they faced in World War I. It's not excusing their actions, of course, but it's just providing context, okay? So that's why the Civil War, it's so important to consider in terms of its destruction when we talk about the healing, because trying to get over this pain is a very difficult thing to do. So what other obstacles did the federal government, led by President Lincoln, face after winning this war? So not only do you have 20% of the population in the South lost, but you have thousands of widows seeking pensions for their murdered or killed husbands or loved ones. This put a strain on the government. How about burying the dead? There were hundreds of thousands of bodies and corpses all over the South. They needed to be buried. Paying veterans, rebuilding southern cities and plantations. My goodness, General Sherman in 1864 for the Union Army led his famous March through Georgia, where his soldiers were not fed by the government. His plan was just to raid and steal food, burn plantations down, and burn cities, make the South howl. And he did. The march to Georgia was very destructive, but we must keep in mind it was also the period in history where more slaves were liberated than any other period in U.S. history, because as the U.S. soldiers went through plantations, they freed the slaves. But this was so destructive. We have just an infrastructure ruined, railroads and cities burnt down. And I think the most important issue that really faced, that the nation faced was, what do you do with all the formerly enslaved Americans? They're free now. Because Abraham Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment during the war, abolishing slavery, except, and we'll get into this later, except if it's prison labor. But nonetheless, slavery was abolished. So what do you do with this new population that has nothing? They were literally treated like property. They were not allowed to read or write or advance. What do you do now with them? So what was the federal government going to do with the formerly enslaved population? So let's start with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is going to be the first president, or, obviously because the war's going on, but he's going to be the first one to come up with a plan for what to do. How do we unite the country? How do we go over these obstacles? But before we go into Abraham Lincoln, we need to know context behind him. Very much throughout the telling of the Civil War and history, a lot of U.S. figures seem to be romanticized, puffed up to be something that they may not have been. And no human being, of course, is immune to their mistakes. So I want to keep you aware of Abraham Lincoln and his views on race. Okay? Lincoln was not supportive of granting citizenship to Black Americans. He was influenced by Thomas Jefferson's writings about expulsing Black people out of the nation, and he also supported Henry Clay's Colonization Society back in the 1850s. And his plan, as late as 1862, while the war was going on, was to take all the newly freed, formerly enslaved Americans and send them to Panama, to a place called Chiriquí, Panama. So, he did not intend on giving citizenship to African Americans after the war. But as the war went on, it was a military necessity and a tactical necessity to abolish slavery, to avoid the Confederacy getting European allies, right? If you make the war about ending slavery, it made it easier. So Lincoln himself, remember, he did not want to grant full citizenship towards African Americans. This is something that we need to know, especially because he is the guy that will be responsible for trying to heal the nation after. So let's look at the early attempts that Abraham Lincoln had to help African Americans and newly freed Americans during the war. So the year is 1864. In 1864, more soldiers were dying in the war than any other year combined. It was a pretty dramatic year of the Civil War. Not only that, you had the presidential election, okay? So he needed to run for re-election. In this time, he passed the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment has two sections, and basically this amendment abolished slavery. And let's take a look at this amendment, actually. It's in two sections. So section 1 says, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any other place to their jurisdiction." Okay? So this is saying that slavery is done, except if it's punishment for a crime and the person is arrested. Keep that in the back of your head. Because when we talk about Reconstruction, this is going to be abused by Southern states. So that's basically what the 13th Amendment does. He ends slavery. But also, the other thing Abraham Lincoln does is in March 1865, 1 month before he's assassinated, and 1 month before the war ends, he creates the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is basically a group, a government group within the United States that planned on helping out the newly freed enslaved Americans. Because once you free the newly freed or enslaved Americans, they need help. They need an education. They need access to wealth. They need a chance to actually start and catch up to their white counterparts who have the rights that African Americans didn't. So the Freedmen's Bureau was kind of like the government group that was going to help solve the equity problem and lift African Americans up by giving them access to federal aid and federal resources so that they could advance. And one of the most important things that the Freedmen's Bureau did was 2 items. So ready? We're going to go over both of them. Number one, the reallocation of lands for the formerly enslaved Americans. What does that mean? Well, in 1864, General Sherman was marching through Georgia. Remember, we talked about that? As he was freeing all those slaves on the plantations, there were a lot of African Americans following the Union Army. What was he going to do with them? He allowed some of them to remain in camp as contraband, and these African Americans cleaned clothes for the soldiers, built roads, and all that. But his plan was order number 15, which was this: 40,000 acres of land from South Carolina to Georgia, all along the Atlantic coast, was made for these newly freed African Americans. What this means is General Sherman kicked off all of the white plantation owners, kicked them off their land, said, you can't live here anymore. This is going to be land for the newly freed Americans. Okay, let's give them this land so they could build wealth and actually compete as American citizens. So the Freedmen's Bureau was created to help facilitate that. So they could use federal money to fund the land. It's basically radical land redistribution, but to help formerly enslaved Americans. So that was the first thing the Freedmen's Bureau did: give land to newly freed Americans. The second thing was educating newly freed Americans. These formerly enslaved Americans were strictly punished if they tried to educate themselves on literacy, reading or writing. It was punishable in many cases even by death. So the Freedmen's Bureau's job was to not only give land to these formerly enslaved Americans, but to educate them, to use federal money to build schools so that they could advance and compete with their white counterparts. Okay? So those were the 2 ways that the Freedmen's Bureau was helping African Americans: giving them land and educating them. So let's review. What did Lincoln do? Early attempts: Lincoln passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, and then the Freedmen's Bureau, which gave land to newly freed Americans and educated them. So now that the war ended in April 1865, Lincoln unraveled his first plan for Reconstruction. What was the first thing he was going to do? Okay? He had a plan that had 2 things. So I want you to listen to this. He required all those southern states who lost the war. He said, hey, you got to adopt the 13th Amendment. You will not be let back into the country unless you adopt and ratify the 13th Amendment. So get rid of slavery. And then the second thing was, hey, out of everyone in your state, 10% of the eligible property owners living in the Confederate States, or former Confederate States, must make an oath of loyalty. That's it. This was a very dangerous plan because these terms were very favorable to the former Confederate states because white Southerners expressed their grief and loss of the war through open efforts to assert the same social order they fought and died for, white supremacy. White Southerners openly promised, and this was legit, like openly promised, that African Americans would never advance from their previous position. Lincoln's plan did not leave room for voting rights for African Americans, leaving them victim to the white Southern electorate. Again, who openly called for the continuation of white supremacy's social, cultural, political, and economic norms. You see, the South was bitter from losing this war. 20% of all the white men in the South lost loved ones. They would never allow the society that their loved ones fought and died for to be erased by seeing African Americans socially advance. So when the author is talking about, of this book, White Rage, is talking about every time black advancement is a thing and moving up, there is a white response to push those advances back. That's exactly what this is. These white Southerners lost so much in the war, and just seeing their, speaking frankly from their point of view, their former property be given federal rights and seeing them advance, that made them furious. It was the right thing to do, of course, but it made them furious, and Lincoln basically allowed it to happen. He did not give these newly freed American citizens, these African Americans, the right to vote. But all this changed in April 1865, 1 month later. As you know, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. So what do we do now? The president is dead. The country is divided. Southern states, former Confederates, the former enemy, right? They are angry at us. How could we unite our country? President Andrew Johnson was the next in line. He was Lincoln's vice president. And President Andrew Johnson, from starting in 1865, created his own plan for Reconstruction. And because Andrew Johnson was not assassinated, his plan was the law of the land. This is what he started. So let's just like how we did context for Abe Lincoln, let's talk about Andrew Johnson, for those who don't know. Andrew Johnson was born in Tennessee. He grew up poor. Okay, so he rose through the ranks, you know, that American dream. With hard work, he rose up and became a politician. But he always had this anger, this disdain for slave owners. He really did not like slave owners. And it's pretty clear that it wasn't because there was a moral problem with slavery. In fact, his anger towards the slave aristocracy of the South was mostly because of class differences. Okay, he grew up poor and he saw these white plantation owners as, you know, greedy, as wealthy, as not sharing the wealth and giving equal opportunity to the poorer whites like himself. So during the Civil War, he was very, very prominent in speaking out and punishing slave owners. So at first glance, you think, yeah, well, you know what? If we're talking about Reconstruction and trying to end slavery once and for all and getting over the loss of the war, he might be a good pick. But his disdain for African Americans was very apparent. He did not have the interest in giving citizenship rights to these newly freed Americans. On October 1865, just to give you an idea of this, Johnson gave a speech to a USCT regiment. So USCT stands for U.S. Colored Troop. These were black soldiers who fought in the Union Army. Okay, so imagine this. The President Johnson is speaking to soldiers who gave their lives and their service for the United States. And in this speech, President Johnson lectured these hardened veterans on the responsibilities of freedom. He literally was telling them that freedom was, quote, well, freedom, quote, is not simply the principle to live in idleness or to resort to the low saloons, end quote. This guy's literally telling veterans who fought for their freedom that, hey, now that you have freedom, don't be lazy. Don't go to the bars and get drunk. That's how he viewed African Americans. And this was the guy who was going to create the Reconstruction plan to not only end slavery, but to allow citizenship rights for African Americans, which he was not going to do. So let's look at Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. So now that Lincoln's dead, what do we do with the southern states? Johnson says, well, let's pardon the Confederate leaders. This comes as a huge surprise for many veterans, even Southerners. They couldn't believe it. Robert E. Lee, the general who led the Confederate military and killed so many Northern soldiers, you're not going to arrest him? You're not going to hang him? You're not going to exile him? You're going to pardon him? Pardoning means forgiving, all right? Alexander Stephens, the vice president, you're not going to put him in jail? You're going to pardon him? Yeah, Johnson believed that pardoning or forgiving the Confederate leaders who once fought against the country will make reconciliation easier. Now, he was right about that. Reconciliation for white Americans. Okay? Because many of the people that Johnson pardoned fought for the Confederacy, which was a nation fighting to preserve a slaveocracy, a society that has its political, social, cultural, economic, and geographic foundations in white supremacy. So imagine being a black American living in Arkansas or Texas or North Carolina and seeing that the President of the United States is allowing your former slave owners, your former masters, the people who fought to keep you in chains, he's not only forgiving them, but allowing them to take roles in the federal and state governments. People like the former vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, were allowed to run state governments. This is the guy who, in his cornerstone address in 1861, said, quote, "Our government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition." End quote. After that line, the South Carolina group that he was talking to applauded at that. Mississippi. In Mississippi's Declaration of Secession in 1861, many of the signers who agreed with what I'm about to read you were pardoned by Johnson. Mississippi said, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth." End quote. So listen, like, the Confederacy fought to preserve slavery because it was economically useful. Their whole society was based off it. Their ideologies and beliefs were founded on the ideals of racial supremacy, white supremacy. And Johnson pardons them. Okay? So this perspective towards race did not go away. And the signers of those secession documents that I read to you were federally pardoned. And not only were they allowed to like not get arrested, but people like Alexander Stephens and former Confederates were allowed to create and pass laws within their own states. So again, like, I got to ask you, imagine, think about this. Imagine being a newly freed American living on your own land that the government and the Freedmen's Bureau gave you in Georgia, and now the former Confederate leaders are back in charge, and the president allowed it. So this is what the College Board is saying when questions of federal power are up in the air, are unresolved, right? Many African Americans said, "Hey, this is a failure of the federal government. What are you doing, man?" But not only was this the only thing Johnson planned, another part of Johnson's Reconstruction was this: the status quo of continuing the economic system of a poor, racialized, and exploited labor force was preserved. How did Johnson do this? Johnson attacked the Freedmen's Bureau and rescinded the land redistribution order. So not only were Confederate leaders brought back into power, but all of those newly freed Americans who were given land in Georgia and South Carolina by the Freedmen's Bureau had to be kicked off. You don't own that land anymore. Nope, sorry, I don't know who told you you could, but you can't now. And the former plantation owners who owned that property came back. This is almost like a horror movie if you think about it, right? I like a political horror movie. Imagine, again, you make all these gains of, wow, we have land. There's a Freedmen's Bureau. They're giving us an education. But then the president comes in and brings back your murderer, brings back your assaulter, brings back the person who kept you in chains. And this person is not happy that you went along with this. Johnson openly said in his plan that the states had more rights than the federal government. This is going to be important, okay? So in this time when the country needs to come back together, strong leadership is needed to ensure that the civil rights of newly freed Americans is protected. President Johnson allows the southern states, the former enemy, the former Confederacy, to have their own rights and do their own thing. Pass your own laws. We'll allow you to pretend none of this happened if you just come back into the country. President Johnson's 1865 December address to Congress talked about how the Civil War was won and the country was saved through reconciliation. However, the civil rights of African Americans and the 13th Amendment were totally ignored. Okay? Even though civil rights were a part of like the Bill of Rights, like it was federally important for the government to enforce civil rights for African Americans. Yeah, no, he just ignored it. He said, no, states, you could do your own thing. I know the Constitution says this, but ignore it. Johnson even allowed South Carolina. Hear this. Johnson even allowed South Carolina to add if and but when statements to their own state's interpretation of the 13th Amendment. Literally a federal amendment. So he's allowing South Carolina, the state who started the Civil War in the first place by firing upon Fort Sumter, he's allowing South Carolina to interpret a federal amendment, a federal law in their own way. Oh, my diet, the diet that you're putting me on says I can't eat ice cream. Well, I'm going to eat ice cream anyway. That's basically what Johnson's allowing here, except it's the 13th Amendment, slavery. So listen to this, guys and girls. Like, the southern states, they wanted to recreate slavery and go back to the way things were. And the only thing preventing them from doing this was the federal government. The people who won the Civil War. And the federal government was allowing the South to go back to the lifestyle, to go back to the same rules, the same way of life, slavery, as close as they legally could, just for reconciliation. And ladies and gentlemen, this is what caused the Civil War, like states that ruled like they were, states that defended slavery, states that took away civil rights from human beings. That's what caused the Civil War. A lot of the disagreements and frustrations. And those same things are being allowed back. Like, okay, you can get back to it. Continue. Florida straight up just ignored the 13th Amendment, as did Mississippi. And in fact, Mississippi's governor was a former Confederate general who fought at the Battle of Gettysburg named Ben Humphreys. and he was governor in 1870, so 5 years later. And Governor Humphreys of Mississippi openly, straight up refused to ratify the 13th Amendment. So, like, Mississippi, how could they be allowed to re-enter the Union if they're just not accepting the 13th Amendment? In fact, 7 out of the 11 former Confederate states refused to ratify the 13th Amendment, which was an amendment that ended slavery. Kentucky would ratify the 13th Amendment in 1975. Mississippi, they would ratify and eventually certify the 13th Amendment in 2003. Some of you were born that year. Some of you were alive in 2003. Heck, some of you might even be alive in 1975 when Kentucky ratified it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an abuse of federal power and states' rights. So, do we see how the College Board is telling us that there's states' rights versus federal rights? You know what I mean? And states' rights are saying, hey, we have the power to ignore the 13th Amendment. You know, Mississippi, we don't like what you're doing, so we're just going to straight up ignore it. In that case, the federal government should have punished Mississippi. Right? You're breaking the law. You're supposed to abolish slavery. Why are you bringing it back? Okay, so this is what the College Board is telling you, with the federal government really, like, allowing the states to do their own thing. And what blows my mind, you know, as a history teacher, when we talk about history repeating itself, the bloodiest war in American history was fought because of slavery, because of disagreements over, you know, what's going on in the southern states economically, politically, culturally, socially. So many Americans die in this war. And then as soon as the war is over and they're trying to bring the country back together, those same policies that started the war are being brought back. And President Johnson's okay with that. So let's talk about what the impacts of this were. So let's use a historical thinking skill, causation, cause and effect. What are the impacts or the effects of Johnson allowing the federal government to sit back and let the states do their own thing? Ready? The first thing is this. Confederate leaders who fought to preserve a society that relied on racial oppression and labor reclaimed control over their state governments again. So a former Confederate cabinet member recalled, quote, "The white South was so devastated and demoralized, it would have accepted almost any of the North's terms. But once Johnson held up before us the hope of a white man's government, it led us to set aside Negro suffrage and to resist the Northern plans to improve the condition of the freedmen." End quote. So this even surprised the Confederacy, and the Southerners are like, wow, we're not being punished for what we did. All right, Johnson's allowing for a white government, a white man's government. And that's exactly what these former Confederate leaders bring to states like North Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, all right, all of them. So what are the impacts of those laws? Confederate states, here's another one. Confederate states re-entered the Union without granting political protection and voting rights to African Americans. So not only do you have your Confederate leaders and former slave owners back in charge, but no protections are given to African Americans. So Southern states began to rewrite their constitutions and enter the United States again. And many of them excitedly rewrote their constitution, knowing that the president was going to allow for a white man's government. So these conditions mirrored pre-war slavery, and even with the 13th Amendment. So Louisiana, in their constitution in 1865, they said that the state was so confident, all right? We're talking about Louisiana. Louisiana was so confident that President Johnson would reallow the state into the Union, they included this in their constitution. Quote, "We hold this to be a government of white people, made and to be perpetuated for the exclusive benefit of the white race, and in accordance with the constant support of the U.S. Supreme Court." Why are they throwing in the Supreme Court there? This is 1865, remember. Okay, so what they're referencing is the Dred Scott decision. Louisiana is saying, hey, remember when the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott decision in 1856 that anyone of African ancestry is unable to become a citizen? Yeah, Louisiana supports that, and this is what we stand for. And it was allowed. President Johnson allowed this. So it goes to show you, even among the North, even among the vice president of the United States in a war that ended slavery, the economic, political, cultural, and social advancement of Black Americans was not supported in the North, and especially not the South. And this is where we go into one of the more distressing impacts of this. So, Johnson's plan. You have the former perpetrators, the former murderers, the former assaulters of your newly freed Americans back in charge. Not only are they on the land that you once owned, they're back there, but now they're in the government, they're passing the laws. And ladies and gentlemen, some of the laws that these Confederate states pass, when you read them, it makes you think that slavery never went away. That's one thing that when I studied Reconstruction, you often wonder, like, well, the Civil War ended slavery, right? No, it didn't end slavery. Because of the failures of the federal government in the Reconstruction period, slavery just evolved. And I want you to consider that word, evolved, as I read to you the Mississippi Black Codes of the 1860s. So the 13th Amendment, remember the one that ended slavery, forced southern states to use legal loopholes to maintain the same racially exploitive labor system. Because remember, Mississippi, Arkansas, the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, ladies and gentlemen, their whole economy, their wealth was based on slavery. If you just took that away, the South would be an economic desert. So the South and the white Southerners, I should say, did everything in their power to try to bring back slavery and preserve it because they needed a population of people to exploit. They needed to exploit poor labor and racialized labor to, bring back the money, bring back the wealth. There's no way we could survive without it. Our country and our region, the southern states, have always been like this. All right? In every avenue. So they're doing everything they could to preserve. So they allow slavery to evolve by creating black codes. So listen to these state laws. In Mississippi, all African Americans must sign an annual labor contract with a white plantation, mill, or mine owner. If you want to be a teacher or a doctor, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to go to school to become a lawyer and you're black, you're not allowed to. You need to have proof that you're working for a white plantation, mill, or mine owner. Another part of the black codes was this: refusing to sign a labor contract, saying, oh, no, I want to be a lawyer. I don't want to work on a plantation anymore. Refusing to do that made you arrested for vagrancy. The police would come and arrest you for vagrancy, which was punishable by being sold on the auction block to the highest bidder as a prisoner. The 13th Amendment allowed for slavery if the enslaved people were prisoners. So all of those slave catchers, do you know what they ended up evolving into? These slave patrols turned into police forces for many of these southern states, looking for any African Americans not at work so they could arrest them, put them in jail, and sell them to plantations for their labor. Here's another one. Breaking contracts. So if you're an African American and you break a labor contract, I'm not going to work today, or I'm not doing this, you'd be arrested for vagrancy. And you know what happens if you're arrested for vagrancy? You're literally sent to jail and forced to work on a plantation as a slave. And the 13th Amendment allows it because you're not a slave, you're a prisoner. African Americans were also banned from hunting or fishing. Now, why is this important? This made African Americans dependent on their employer. If you were hungry you were not allowed to hunt or fish. So where would you get food? They're literally recreating slavery. They're bringing it back, except in this legal form, right? So now many of your African Americans either have to grow their own food on their former slave master's plantation or whoever they're working for, or, according to their contracts, hope that their owners give them enough food to survive. Here's another insidious one. This is a pretty upsetting law. But before the Civil War, okay, when legal slavery, like literal chattel slavery, was still a thing within the United States, children who were sold away from their parents before the war were apprenticed off. So think about this. Imagine being a newly freed American citizen. Okay, you're a mother, you're a father, and you haven't heard from your child in 4 years because back in 1860 your child was sold off to Mississippi. All right, your child was sent away. So many of these African Americans, these newly freed Americans, are looking for their children. I need to come back. I need to be reunited with my child. Southern state laws said that these children were not allowed to be returned to their parents. In fact, they were sent to plantations and apprenticed off to white mill, mine, or plantation owners. And if anyone protested against these conditions, the penalty for defiance in almost every southern state included whippings. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back to the era of slavery, except an evolved version of it. And African Americans, by law, according to these black codes, were tied to the plantations, mines, and mills. By law, they were not allowed to leave them, or else they were punished by the police with vagrancy. And as you know, as we talked, what does that mean? You're not sent to prison. You're sold on the auction block to a plantation. So I need you to understand this very important fact. When we say that slavery was ended after the American Civil War, we need to re-examine that. Because was it? The practices that you're seeing here actually encompass a vocab word that you need to know. This is called sharecropping. When African Americans are forced to work on plantations again by law, according to these black codes, that's called sharecropping. Okay? We'll talk more about sharecropping later on when we talk about the civil rights movement, because ladies and gentlemen, these black codes remained in existence way up until the 1960s. That's how long this was still going on. So again, after reading those black codes, did you notice that none of these black codes included slavery by name? Slaves were referenced as prisoners, those who are arrested for vagrancy, right? And here's the thing. Because slavery was not in the language of these laws, it was perfectly legal. And how did Northerners view this? Well, of course, there were many Northerners, especially African Americans living in the North, appalled by this. We fought a war to end this, and you're bringing it back. But many white Northerners viewed this as acceptable because slavery, in their mind, was gone because the word slave is not in the law, right? One of these people was future president and former Union Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant agreed with the black codes and said that the Freedmen's Bureau was harboring, quote, unrealistic expectations for former slaves, end quote. See, many Northerners wanted to end slavery, but they held racist stereotypes built from that culture we talked about last unit of white supremacy, that they believed that African Americans, once given freedom, would struggle with it, would become idle, would become lazy. And of course, these are stereotypes. These are not real. Because who's doing all the work here, right? But nonetheless, many Northerners actually accepted this system of black codes because they just witnessed those in prison as prisoners. You know, they're not slaves. They went to jail. The police arrested them. They're criminals. So finally, one of the other effects of this failure in federal power was this. Resentful Southern whites, sour from the war. Remember, they lost 20% of all white men in the war. So they're pretty upset. So resentful Southern whites who are angry that they lost loved ones in this war began to openly murder black Americans. A campaign of terrorism was instituted to enforce the black codes. When you have pardoned Confederate leaders back in state government ruling over Mississippi again, or Florida, or Georgia again, they do not put legal protections in for black Americans. We have records from President Johnson's emissary, a guy named Carl Schurz. He wrote about his travels whenever he went through the South. So he kept a diary. And in it, he said that it was common to see the bodies of lynch victims on the roads, in the trees, or floating down rivers, county by county, state by state. And without legal protection, ladies and gentlemen from the government, what we see in 1865 and 1866, right after the war, is the American version of Kristallnacht. And it was done on a daily basis in the South. And for those who don't know, Kristallnacht is that moment in 1937 or 1938 in Nazi Germany when police and German citizens just openly started raiding Jewish shops and burning them down. And it's basically the purge. And I teach a modern genocide course. And one of the things that we talk about in the stages of genocide is this open violence. And this is legit, according to Genocide Watch and Dr. Gregory Stanton. This extrajudicial killing of a minority who was not protected by a government through civil rights, that's genocide. And we see this in the South. So that is the impact of Johnson during the Reconstruction era. So that was the beginning. It started out very, very, very bad. Confederate states were allowed to just come back into the Union as if nothing happened, and they just allowed for this form of racial terrorism to occur just so that the South could reinstitute the same type of society that initially started the Civil War in the first place, right? So with that, we're going to move into the next phase of Reconstruction, starting in 1866 and 1867. Okay, so a year after the Civil War. Okay, we're going to learn about the opposition to President Johnson. And here's the deal. Like, we talked about what's happening in the South right now. Many Americans were disgusted by Johnson's inaction. Number one, he was too lenient on those former Confederate leaders. This angered many Northern veterans. Like, could you imagine being like a mother who lost a loved one, who lost a child at the Battle of Gettysburg? You know, the Confederates killed my son. And now Governor Benjamin Humphreys of, what state? Mississippi is back. Like, how are you not arresting the leaders of this horrible rebellion that killed my son? So many Northerners were upset. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we bringing back these Confederate leaders? Number two, Northern African Americans advocated for Congress to do something about the genocide that was happening. It was literally open season down in the South where African Americans were being targeted and killed. And among those who were specifically targeted and killed by these racial terrorists, these white terrorists, were African Americans who fought in the Union Army or supported the Union Army in any way. So those were many of the people who were killed. And Black Americans and white Americans too were like, hey, these are veterans. These are people who fought for their country, and they're just being murdered without a trial. Like, their murderers are getting away scot-free. This is not okay. Especially, and look at the black codes, man. Like, they brought back slavery. How is this okay with the 13th Amendment? And also, how is it okay for states to just not even ratify the 13th Amendment? They're ignoring the federal government. So many Americans were upset that the federal government was not doing enough. And these Americans fell along a political party. So here's where we talk about the political parties. If you have a question about this era, okay? The Democratic Party was that of the Southern slaveholders. The Democratic Party of the United States was a states' rights, white supremacy, mostly white supremacy, political party, okay? That did not like the federal government. Republicans was the political party, okay, that wanted the federal government to have more power than state governments. And many Republicans wanted to give civil rights to African Americans, okay? So, two political factions within Congress and the federal government began to challenge Johnson, and both of them were Republicans. You had your moderate Republicans and your radical Republicans, okay? Who were your moderates? Your moderates were people who believed that President Johnson didn't do enough. He was too lenient on those Confederate leaders, and now he's allowing states to have more power than the federal government? What? No, that's not cool. So that's the moderates. Who are the radicals? Why are they called radical? What's so bad about them? The radicals agreed with the moderates on everything we read before, but they were called radical because these people, these politicians, advocated for land, citizenship, and voting rights for African Americans. That was considered radical. Think about that, okay? Democrats at this time, like I said, were majority states' rights, and what happened is the Republicans, the moderates, and the radicals teamed up because they had a majority and said, you know what? We're going for the president. We're going to challenge him. So, they knew that President Johnson would never, ever in a million years allow black citizenship or the black vote. So what did they do? How are we going to challenge the president here? How are we going to challenge the federal government? Okay, two things. Number one, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill. This bill advocated for the continuation of land redistribution to black families in the South, as well as the continued federal funding for building schools in the South for African Americans. Because the Freedmen's Bureau was only going to last for 1 year. It was going to expire a year after it was created, and that year came. It's 1866 now. So the Republicans said, hey, let's just continue it. Let's allow for the Freedmen's Bureau to help newly freed Americans to get access to their own land, and let's educate them. And the other thing is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Moderate and radical Republicans pushed this, and it was the first Civil Rights Act ever to be discussed in Congress in our nation's history. It called for citizenship for African Americans, that the right to buy, own, and sell property, regardless of color, is allowed by federal law. So that's what they wanted. They wanted African Americans to have citizenship rights. What do you think Johnson said when this bill was passed by Congress? Because you know how the U.S. government works, right? The president has to sign the bill into law. Both houses of Congress, the Senate and Congress, Senate and House of Representatives pass a bill together, and the president has to sign it into law. Johnson looks at these two bills and says, nope. He vetoed both of them. He said, no way. We are not going to do this. Why? Why? Now, when we talk about the thesis of Anderson's book, White Rage, where this material is coming from, this thesis argues that whenever black Americans try to make progress in U.S. history to better advance themselves, there is a white response that pushes them back, that almost punishes them. tries to maintain a status quo that exploits their labor, right? That's what's happening in the black codes, right? So when we see the federal government saying, hey, we need to help these people, we need to give them civil rights, they're literally being killed down there, what do we do? I want you to pay attention to the justifications for why President Johnson did not want to extend these privileges, or these rights rather, these rights to African Americans. Because when we talk about white rage, at least when the author does, she says that these typical responses historically are made to push back, push back the black advancement. This is how it's done. Ready? Johnson believed that number one, these two bills did not represent the southern state governments, which were ruled by the Democratic Party. So Johnson's saying, hey, the South is mostly ruled by Democrats, so why should a Republican rule be sent there? Like, that's not fair. Johnson also says the Freedmen's Bureau was seen as a federal overreach of states' rights. But here are the specific things that President Johnson cited and said that opposed civil rights. So ready? This is what he said. So he argued that if the he said the Freedmen's Bureau straight up, the Freedmen's Bureau is discriminatory. The Freedmen's Bureau is not fair to white Americans. He said that if schools were not being built for the white race, why should black Americans get special treatment? He said it would make black Americans, quote, dependent on the federal government, end quote, for handouts. And I want to, put that in context here. That particular claim that's saying, if you help on black Americans, they're just going to ask for handouts. They're going to be too dependent on the government. This retort has roots in the stereotypical belief that African Americans are not hard workers and will become idle without control. Remember President Johnson giving that speech to those Union veterans in October 1865, saying that, now you have freedom. Don't be lazy and don't get drunk. That kind of patronizing talking down, right? That's that whole statement of, if you help African Americans, it's going to make them dependent on the government. It has roots in that stereotype of the idle, lazy African American, which is not true. It's laughably not true, knowing that, it's African Americans themselves who built this country in the condition where they were not given any of the labor that they supplied. What else do we have here? So Johnson opposed the Freedmen's Bureau spending government money to fund the redistribution of land to newly freed people. He said, if the federal government is not buying land for poor white Americans, it was seen as unfair. So do you hear that? He's angry that just because black Americans are being given the opportunity to lease land from the federal government so they have a lifestyle, a place to start up, he said that's not fair because white people don't have that. I want you to look back in U.S. history, back to 1862, when Abraham Lincoln passed the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was an act specifically geared towards white Americans, incentivizing them to move west, where the U.S. government literally gave acres of land to anybody who applied to settle west of the Mississippi River. Talk about land redistribution. That was okay, but not this, right? So it's not that it's discriminatory to white people. No, this is an example of white supremacy. If you allow black Americans the opportunity to advance, if you allow them to get land so they could raise a family securely and advance, they're gonna rise up to us? No, we can't have that. So yes, that's a part of the whole institutional nature of racism. So Johnson also maintained the position of the freedmen. He's saying that these former slaves, these former enslaved Americans, they're much better off now than they ever have been. Slavery's over. Which, again, that's not true. at all. Johnson said, and again, although this is not true, Johnson said that he's not going to support civil rights because if African Americans are upset with the system, they have the freedom to leave the states and move somewhere else. He said, if you don't like it, you could get out. But the black codes in states like Mississippi, Florida, and Georgia made it punishable by vagrancy if they left the plantations. So legally, African Americans were not allowed to leave. Johnson also said that African Americans should build their own schools rather than depending on handouts from the government. So it is crucial to understand that given these criticisms, it was African Americans who generated the wealth of the United States without receiving any of it in return, by the way. In other words, white America and the government were dependent on African Americans. So much so that Johnson's administration ignored a federal amendment, reinstated the Confederacy in almost everything but the title, despite 3% of the population dying in the war because of them, stifled economic and democratic advancement, and allowed for extrajudicial violence in southern states. That's how much white America, in particular Andrew Johnson, was willing to risk and give up just to make sure that black economic independence was crushed. So once again, this black economic independence, black Americans finally having land, trying to advance in society, that challenged the power structure that existed. Because the power structure of the United States, and in particular the southern states at that time, depended on that cheap, exploitable labor based on race. And they were willing to go through so many measures to preserve that. And like I said, many of the things that they were willing to give up to preserve it were the same things that brought them into the Civil War in the first place. So when you think about why in 2021 we still have disagreements and conflicts over the American Civil War, ladies and gentlemen, it was not solved. This is a reason why. So let's talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, so while these civil rights movements under the Republican Party were being stopped, the Freedmen's Bureau was still trying to build schools for African Americans. They were still working hard because that was one of the few federal institutions that allowed for the equitable advancement of black Americans. A Louisiana legislator in this era, in the 1860s, said that the only thing keeping the Freedmen's Bureau alive and all these schools from being burnt down was the presence of U.S. soldiers in the South. That's it. And the majority of the schools in the South built for black Americans were built and managed by, well, African Americans themselves. For example, in Georgia in 1866, 96 of the 123 schools in the whole state of Georgia were funded by African Americans themselves. Even in the oppressive environment of the black codes, it's incredible to consider how these African Americans, many of them formerly enslaved Americans, persevered. They still fought back. But listen, let's go back to the whole political situation with Reconstruction. The federal government is allowing the southern states to literally recreate the Confederacy and allow slavery again through the 13th Amendment. What did the Republicans do? The president just vetoed their civil rights bill. Well, the radical Republicans override Johnson's veto, and they actually enact legislation. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 happened regardless. Congress said, hey, you know what, Andrew Johnson? Too bad. I don't care if you like it or not. We're doing it. So with this oversight, they instituted the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Johnson's opposition for civil rights revolved around his desire to see African Americans earn it themselves without special treatment. But because Congress vetoed the president, the civil rights movement was extended in the South. So now all of a sudden, the federal government is getting a little bit stronger. Republicans in Congress are saying, well, President, if you're not going to institute federal power, I guess it's up to us. So they go for it. And they institute that. But now, what occurs as a result? Now that a Civil Rights Act is passed, you start to see African Americans in the South talk about advancement again. Oh, wow, the federal government might actually help us. Maybe we could petition for the right to vote. Maybe we could advance together. So the Southern response to this, the white Southern response, was terrorism. Because many of these white Southerners saw that this granting civil rights to African Americans was a huge threat to their system, right? Because if they're given civil rights, now they're federally protected by the federal government in Washington, D.C. So Mississippi can't get their way. So terrorism is what's done. A huge rise in anti-black violence happens in 1866 because whites were the minority in some of these southern states. I mean, some of these districts in Mississippi and Alabama and Florida and Georgia, African Americans outnumber whites. So many of these white people were afraid that, oh my goodness, if the government allows black Americans to vote, we're going to be outvoted. And our system of government, our way of life is going to be destroyed and all this. So what ends up happening is this terrorism. In 1866, something called the New Orleans Massacre happened. Black Republicans gathered at the city courthouse in New Orleans to talk about voting rights. Because, hey, the federal government's talking about civil rights for us. So let's talk about voting. The mayor of New Orleans dispatched the police department and even the fire department to prevent these black Republicans from entering the building to even have a debate. They said, you got to get through us first. And then the white mob attacked. The police attacked. The firefighters attacked. And many Confederate veterans attacked these black Republicans. 50 African Americans were massacred on this day, and 100 were injured. And this next statistic shocks me when we're talking about terrorism. In the state of Texas, 1,000 African Americans were lynched from 1866 to 1868. If you do the math, that is 6 lynchings per week. So 6 of the 7 days of the week, at least one African American living in Texas was lynched. This was racial terrorism. This was the white response saying, hey, if any of you try to vote and, believe that the federal government's going to help you, we're going to scare you into submission. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the same type of tactics that the white Southerners used during the era of slavery. Whenever slaves threatened rebellion or whenever slaves were rebellious or thought of escaping, violence was used to preserve the system and scare enslaved persons into submission. Well, this same violence is being perpetuated again. So it makes sense, right? In that context, that we see a huge rise of white terrorism in the South. So what the government does, the federal government, okay, listen to this. Are you kind of sensing that there's a battle between the states and the federal government? Like, Mississippi is ruled by many of these former Confederates, these white former Confederates who owned slaves in the past, before the war. And they do not like that the federal government is trying to give civil rights to its black citizens. So Mississippi's like straight up rebelling again. Mississippi is creating terrorist organizations, right? So what does the federal government do? It's their move now. The federal government is observing that there is terrorism in the United States, specifically in the South. Major General J.J. Reynolds of the United States Secretary of War reported in 1868 that, quote, armed organizations, generally known as Ku Klux Klans, exist independently or in concert with other armed bands in many parts of Texas, but are most numerous, bold, and aggressive east of the Trinity River. The precise objectives or objects of this organization cannot be readily explained, but seems in this state, in Texas, to be to disarm, rob, and in many cases murder Union men and Negroes, and as occasion may offer murder United States officers and soldiers. Also to intimidate everyone who knows anything of the organization, but who will not join it. And this is the part of his quote, this Union general in Texas that kind of sticks with me. Ready? Quote, talking about the terrorism. Quote, to restore the measurable peace and quiet to Texas will require that troops be stationed at many county seats. This will be the work of years. The federal government realized that this rise of terrorism by groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Shirts will require years of work. Okay, just keep that in mind, because we're seeing the federal government in 1867, 1868 actually try their best to help African Americans. They're working really hard. You know, they're sending soldiers and doing their best. But even those doing the work, the federal government's saying, oh my God, they're not willing to give up slavery. They're using terrorism. Like, this is going to last for years. Right? So what does the federal government do in response to this terrorism? They pass something called the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. What were they? Well, it divided the South into 5 military districts. District 1 was Virginia. District 2 was the Carolinas. 3 is Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. 4 is Arkansas and Mississippi. And 5 is Texas and Louisiana. Union soldiers would be sent to each of these districts, and as you saw in that document, they would be sent to county seats, so wherever the courthouse was, and they would patrol the streets. They would act as the police force, trying to preserve the civil rights of African Americans. So good. I mean, the federal government is actually trying to help here. But how do you think the Southerners react to seeing Union soldiers in blue uniforms once again down south patrolling the streets? Tell you what, if I'm a Southerner who lost a loved one in this war, if my son was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg by Union troops, and I see Union troops outside my doorstep, I'm constantly reminded about my dead son. And I'm angry. I'm angry. So the white Southern response to seeing soldiers come back into the South and divide the South up into military districts, man, talk about anger. Talk about bad blood. You're going to see a lot of white Southerners turn to the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groups, such as the Red Shirts of the Carolinas. But nonetheless, we see the federal government trying to take back control. And it is in 1867 where it was kind of alluded to in the previous document, but the Ku Klux Klan is revived and created, or I'm sorry, not revived, founded. The Ku Klux Klan is founded as a terrorist organization. It existed in 1865, but it gained steam in 1867 because, my God, if like I said, many of these white Southerners who fought in the Civil War, I'm telling you, once they saw Union soldiers again marching through their streets, they wanted to do something about it. And the Ku Klux Klan gave them an opportunity to express that anger violently and through terrorism. Also, think of the younger generation of white Americans, in particular like white boys, who were not old enough to fight in the Confederacy, but still had that same drive to fight and serve for a nation that they hoped to see exist, but it was taken away by those blue uniformed soldiers, and they're marching in the streets. So you start to see a lot of young white Southerners join the Ku Klux Klan as well. So you see this Klan. It's a group of Confederate veterans and young white people who were too young during the war, but now are old enough to serve the Confederacy, I guess. They start taking command, and they start terrorizing the South. The Ku Klux Klan starts targeting Unionists, Republicans, white sympathizers who are a part of the Freedmen's Bureau, sometimes those soldiers, and overwhelmingly any African American who tried to act on the civil rights that the federal government was protecting. Does that make sense to you? Because the South, just like in the era of slavery, these white Southerners wanted to punish um, African Americans for advancing in the system, trying to get to the status of the white man politically, socially, and economically. And they policed that with racial violence and terrorism. Much like I mentioned earlier, the any slaves or enslaved persons on plantations who tried to rebel or resist authority, they were met with violence. So the Ku Klux Klan is that manifestation of that violence that existed all throughout the era of slavery. And that's something to consider, knowing that the Ku Klux Klan and many white nationalist terrorist organizations are still in operation today. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a civil rights organization that tracks the movements of hate groups, 47 Ku Klux Klan organizations are in operation as we speak right now, all throughout the United States of America. And white nationalist hate groups in at least 2019 are 155 in number. So right now, since 2019 rather, there are 155 white nationalist hate groups in the United States. So it still exists. Like that's one of these things that we need to keep in mind. Why some of us may argue that, oh, slavery, that was over with. That was in the 1800s. We're done with that. Reconstruction, I mean, that was like over 100 years ago, right? 150 years ago. But no, listen, the same mechanisms that were used to preserve slavery are adopted and being used by hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan and white nationalists. And they still exist in large number to this day in the present United States, right? So when we talk about history being relevant, history does not happen in a vacuum, especially with the cause and effect relationship that history offers us once we analyze it. We could really draw these connections and see that this is a problem that exists in the United States today that still has not been dealt with. With that said, let us get back to the Reconstruction era. Because given this battle, this straight up war between the federal government, who supported civil rights, and state governments in the South, who were against civil rights, let's take a look at what was going on. What was that battle like? So we know there was terrorism, but let's look at some of the gains that were made. Very important gains that as Americans we should be proud of. Okay, so despite this racial terrorism, the Republicans and the radical Republicans who wanted civil rights and voting rights for African Americans eventually got their way. In 1868, remember that Civil Rights Act we talked about? The 66 Civil Rights Act that gave African Americans citizenship within the United States? Well, that was turned into the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment states that individual states, like Mississippi, could not take away rights of citizens without due process of law. This was, especially knowing the context, we're seeing in the 1860s terrorist groups like the Klan and the Red Shirts murder African Americans, right? And if If you wanted justice for any of those murders, the southern states did not provide it. Legally, they only allowed all white juries to run these courts. Many of the judges in these state courts were former Confederate generals and veterans, so clearly it's someone you probably don't want judging your case if you want justice, if your loved one was killed by a white man. So the 14th Amendment was passed because it made it forced due process of law. So every time a crime happened, okay, states couldn't just like ignore it or you know what I mean? They had to actually enforce the law. And that was a major movement in a major advance in the civil rights of citizens within the United States. All citizens too, black and white. All right, it applied to everybody. And this is enshrined in our Bill of Rights. It's the 14th Amendment. Okay, so we're slowly seeing the legal framework develop that's necessary to finally combat and destroy slavery. So, like, the United States has the tools already. Like, the federal government has the tools to ensure civil rights are protected. And the Reconstruction Era is the time when those tools are created. But the problem is the states are just, like, ignoring it. Like, they're not using the tools. Does that make sense? So that's why we still see a continuation of terrorism in the South in this era. Same thing with lynchings and all that. So the 14th Amendment is passed in 1868, where all citizens, African Americans, are citizens, and they have equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment is a game changer. So the next one is voting rights. And it's important to say men, because women were not allowed to vote yet. All men were allowed to vote in the United States, no matter their skin color. That's what the 15th Amendment was. So let's review. The main three amendments you need to know for the AP exam and for this era. The 13th, slavery was made illegal. The 14th, citizenship for all, born in the United States, and what was it? Due process of law, equal protection under the law. And then 15, all men were allowed to vote no matter their skin color. This was huge. And now that African Americans had the right to vote and U.S. soldiers there to protect African Americans, you start to see Southern African Americans vote. And this is huge, ladies and gentlemen, because obviously terrorism is a big threat. The Klan threatened anybody and any African American if they tried to vote. And by the way, Election Day is one of the most dangerous days in the South due to that terrorism. But because Union soldiers and federal soldiers were there to protect civil rights, many African Americans went and voted. And some of these were like, as soon as these civil rights were put in place, you see African Americans elected into Congress. Think about that for a minute. You have, and many of you, I think the number is three of the hold on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I think it was like 3 or 4 of the 7 of these congressmen who were elected that are African American were former slaves. So talk about that. Once the federal government allows for the protection of civil rights, you see incredible things happen. Incredible gains are made. For example, and this all started in 1870 once the 15th Amendment was passed. Senator Hiram Revels, of Mississippi, first African American elected into Congress. Benjamin Turner, Robert Carlos DeLodge, Josiah T. Walls, Jefferson F. Long, Representative Joseph H. Rainey, and Representative Robert B. Elliott of South Carolina. We see Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, all elect black congressmen. That's incredible. Right? So this is what we need to consider. Like, as soon as the civil rights were defended and protected by the federal government in 1870, we see progress. So, despite these gains that were made and progress, there's still that hypocrisy. Southern states were still dominated by white Democrats and many former Confederates. So, Congressman James T. Rapier, one of those African American congressmen that were elected in 1870 for Alabama, he gave a speech regarding support for the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So he gives this speech, and he delivers it to the House of Representatives in 1874. And I want you to pay attention to his words and think about his point of view. Okay? He is a prime example of the hope that exists in this country when the federal government provides civil rights for all citizens, no matter their color. And he says, quote, "But the supremely ridiculous position of the Negro at this time compels me to say something. Here, his condition is without comparison parallel alone to itself. Just that the law recognizes my right upon this floor in Congress as a lawmaker, but that there is no law to secure to me any accommodations whatever while traveling here to discharge my duties as a representative of a large and wealthy constituency. Here I am, the peer of the proudest, but on a steamboat or a railroad car, I am not equal to the most degraded." End quote. He's saying that I'm being treated with respect as a congressman, but if I go back to Alabama, I can't ride on the same train. I actually have to pay out of my own pocket to go to Washington, D.C. because my state's not allowing me to travel. I have to pay for myself. Like, he's saying that this is ridiculous. There still is work to be done. You know what I mean? So, with that position said, we need to talk about the end of Reconstruction, because we talked about the high point. Its high point is as soon as the 15th Amendment and 14th are passed, African Americans are allowed to vote, and they do vote in their best interests to allow Republicans to come in and rule. Okay? But something happens. The 14th and 15th Amendments brought so much hope and prosperity, or visions of hope, to many Americans. However, the Supreme Court, which was all white at the time, was in favor of states' rights. He believed, just like Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S Grant, that the states had the rights to choose themselves if they like to implement these rules. So think back to what the AP College Board is telling you. Issues of federal power and citizenship have not been resolved because of Reconstruction. And this is it. Just as the Republican Party pushed so hard to give federal rights to all, we're now seeing Black Americans advance, right? This is the whole thesis, that they're advancing. They're becoming economically independent. Now they're voting. We have multiple Black members of Congress now. Given the thesis of this book, we have to expect a backlash, because a system that depends on the exploited labor, racialized labor of poor Black Americans would never allow for these amendments to be implemented, because that would challenge the system, right? This is what we talk about with structural racism. It's all about preserving the status quo that allowed for the wealth generated by a system that exploits a minority of people, right? They're trying to preserve that. So what happens? The U.S. Supreme Court nullified these amendments in the southern states. Why did they do this? Stripping states of the rights to govern their own citizens and giving all that power to Washington, D.C. was viewed by the U.S. Supreme Court as unconstitutional. The U.S. Supreme Court interpreted the 14th and 15th Amendments in ways that defended states' rights. That is the nail in the coffin for Reconstruction. Just as these advances were made, allowing Black Americans to advocate for themselves, to get people elected into Congress, we see the backlash. And that comes in the form of states' rights. And not only through terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to see the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, the trusted bureaucracy, the trusted government, right, do the most damage. So I want to give you an example of this. In 1873, thanks to the 15th Amendment, the town of Colfax, Louisiana, elected a Republican government. How brave it must have been, right? Knowing that if you voted, terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Shirts would hunt you down and kill you. How scary must that be? But yet they still voted, and they won. Thankfully, because U.S. soldiers were there to protect them. But this is what happened. So Colfax, Louisiana, elected Republicans. And what happened is these Republicans, and many of them were black Republicans, went into the courthouse in 1873. And the town of Colfax rebelled. Democrats, Confederate veterans, the police, and others surrounded the courthouse and began the massacre, the Colfax Massacre of 1873. 105 to 280 Black Americans were killed when the white mob stormed the courthouse. The chief killers of this massacre were arrested by the federal government under the 1870 Enforcement Act. So that happened because, remember, the Reconstruction Acts, remember, the South was divided into military districts. So the U.S. soldiers saw the massacre. They saw what was going on, but they came too late. They hunted down those responsible for leading the massacre and arrested them. But Louisiana sued Colfax, and Democrats were like, you can't do that. The federal government just can't arrest people. So the Supreme Court responded. Chief Justice Waite said that said that it was Louisiana's state right to convict murderers, not the federal government. So did you hear that? Even though the massacre is definitely breaking the 14th and 15th Amendment, right? Like, those white mobs stormed the Republicans and murdered them because they voted, number one, and because it wasn't their outcome. That's against the law. They broke the civil rights. But the court said, nope. The 14th Amendment only applied to acts of state violence, not individual acts of terror. So that is how this amendment was interpreted. So like, basically what that means is if Louisiana, like if the state of Louisiana caused the violence and murdered those black Republicans in Colfax, then it would have broken the 14th Amendment. But because individuals, like individual citizens, did the violence, it's the state's responsibility to arrest those people, not the federal government. So the Supreme Court said and ruled in favor of states' rights. They said the federal government does not have the power, even with those amendments, to arrest people. The states do. So what do you think Colfax, Louisiana did? With an all-white jury and a Confederate judge and white sympathizers, these murderers were let off scot-free. This is why victims of terrorism from white Southern paramilitary groups like the KKK or the Red Shirts were exempt from federal protection under the 14th Amendment. This is why we see a rise in terrorism. The South and these states found a way to continue the lynchings, continue the murders, and it didn't break the law because the Supreme Court was on their side. Literally, the federal government allowed for this to happen. And if you take anything from it, take this. Domestic terrorism was now defended by the highest court in the land. Because you know sure well that the Democratic governments of Mississippi are not going to punish these murderers and these terrorists. The federal government may have, but not Mississippi. So this remains the case all the way up until the 1960s, ladies and gentlemen. You may know somebody who's alive, or you may have been alive and lived in this era, in a time in U.S. history where this was allowed, where domestic terrorism was defended by the highest court in the land. This is the white response. And not only does it come from terrorism, but it comes from a federal government, a bureaucracy that is all white, making this decision. And is it founded on justice? No, I don't think so. It's founded on that notion of black advancement. When black communities try to advance, there is that backlash because it disrupts the system of an exploited labor force that the nation desires and needs. And I don't want to say that it needs it now. Like, it's obviously horrible and it needs to go away, but there we go. And now, with that said, we're going to talk about the end of Reconstruction. So now that the 14th and 15th Amendments were basically neutered and just straight up not enforced, the Supreme Court said, oh, doesn't apply to the states. States could still choose what they want to do. What ends up destroying Reconstruction? The presidential election of 1876. So let's take a look at that. Let's learn. The only real form of protection for African Americans in the South was federal soldiers. Right? The South was still divided into military districts, and this was very bothersome for white Southerners, because the whole thing was we don't want African Americans to vote. And the only thing protecting that is these soldiers here. So let's take a look. Like I mentioned before, Election Day was the bloodiest day in the South because that's when terrorist groups worked all day and night, roaming the streets, preventing African Americans from voting. Because the South was majority Democrat and they hated Republicans. So the 1876 election was so close and it was contested. Now, what I'm about to say here is very interesting because at the time I'm recording this in 2021, specifically January 5th, 2021, the presidential election of 2020 is currently being contested by Republican candidate President Donald Trump. So when I was reading this history, it's like, wow, here's an example of another contested presidency. So let's see what happened in 1876 when one side was like, nope, I don't accept the results. So the Democrat running for president was a guy named Sam Tilden. He ran on a campaign for states' rights. So all throughout the South, he was very popular among white Southerners and former Confederates. The Republican was Rutherford E. Hayes. Rutherford E. Hayes, again, Republican, was the political party that advocated for federal power over states' rights. So what happened is on Election Day that November, the Democrats appeared to win. They won the swing states of Connecticut, Indiana, New York, and New Jersey. By midnight on election night, the Democrat Tilden had 184 of the 185 electoral votes needed to win. and was leading by the popular vote by 250,000. So, with the popular vote, what happened, I guess, in 1876 was the Democrats were about to win. The Republican Party, Rutherford E. Hayes, refused to accept defeat and accused Democratic supporters of intimidating and bribing African American voters to prevent them from voting in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, which was actually happening. Remember, terrorist organizations like the Red Shirts and the Ku Klux Klan were actively making sure that black Americans were not voting. And Rutherford B. Hayes said, hey, you're not letting them vote. We would have won. So as of 1876, there were the only remaining states in the South with Republican governments were Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. And he says, the only reason why I lost them is because you intimidated African Americans. And like I said, that was true. Specifically in South Carolina, Democratic-led militias, led by former Confederate General Wade Hampton, actually fought shooting battles against African Americans attempting to vote. So there actually was evidence of this. So the Republican Party was pretty upset. So with Republicans refusing to accept defeat, the Southern Democrats offered a deal. They said, all right, hey, listen. If you, the Republican Party, if we let you become president, Rutherford B. Hayes, if we let you become president, will you get rid of those soldiers in the South? Would you get rid of those soldiers occupying our states? The Compromise of 1877. That's what this was called. The Compromise of 1877 allowed for that. The Southern Democrats conceded and said, all right, Rutherford B. Hayes wins. And the first thing Rutherford E. Hayes did in government was withdraw the soldiers out of the South. Think about that. What does that do to the African Americans living in the southern states, depending on these soldiers for their safety? The only reason why so many of them felt safe enough to vote in the 1870s was because these soldiers were there to protect them from terrorism. But the federal government and the Compromise of 1877 withdrew federal protection against terrorism, allowed terrorism to continue, just so that Rutherford E. Hayes could win the presidency. So 1877 is why the video is titled at that, 1864 to 77. It ends here. Because as soon as those federal soldiers leave the South, it's just like 1865 again. It's just like 1866. All of those African Americans who were brave enough to vote in the 1870s, educate their children in the 1870s with the help of Union soldiers protecting them, now faced punishment for it. Now faced a white revenge. This almost decade of progress since 1870's passing of the 15th Amendment was violently punished as soon as those Union soldiers left. And in U.S. history from 1877 all the way up until the Civil Rights Movement, we see a southern United States that maintained slavery through the 13th Amendment, allows for states to interpret the rules through their own 14th Amendment, because as you'll see later on, Plessy versus Ferguson, the 14th Amendment is used by the U.S. Supreme Court to advocate for separate but equal segregation, Jim Crow. And then the 15th Amendment is overridden. Okay, so check this out. As soon as those federal soldiers leave, it's over. the Confederacy won the Civil War, right? The Confederacy was still able to maintain their social hierarchy that granted whites economic privileges over black Americans, right? And it took a few years, but it worked. And what allowed that to happen? The lack of federal power. Because here's the frustrating thing, ladies and gentlemen, for those listening. This history might be frustrating to listen to and almost embarrassing because, like, you have hope as an American citizen, like our country's better. Or if you're a fan of America, right? Like, how can we allow this to happen? In the era of Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were revolutionary. Those amendments alone allowed for so much hope and so much political, economic, cultural, and social progress for African Americans. But it was taken away from them. We have the tools to fix the problem. They're in there. They're in the Constitution. They're in the Bill of Rights. Yet, how these amendments are interpreted is what makes or breaks the system. And in the era of the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s, the U.S. Supreme Court and the state governments of the American South interpret these three amendments in ways that institute slavery once again, that basically make it, rewind the clock back to the 1860s. The 13th Amendment is used by Southern states through their black codes. It's so frustrating to see Southern states at this time period. And this goes all the way up, even till this day. Like, this is still an issue. The 13th Amendment allows for slavery as long as the person is a criminal who was punished. So what the Southern states do, just like we talked about in the Black Codes, is they pass laws where the police could just go and arrest African Americans for vagrancy, put them in the prison system, and then sell prison labor to American plantations and companies and corporations. So the 13th Amendment is used by Southern states, and we see the slave patrols of the South turn into the police departments of the South. Okay? Trying to fill the pool of labor that many of these plantations, corporations, and mills need. Right? So the 13th Amendment is used to bring back slavery. How's about the 14th Amendment? The 14th Amendment is supposed to ensure that African Americans are citizens and equal under the law. So in 1896, a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson happens. Plessy is an African American man who tried to take a train ride. He hopped on a train and was kicked off because he was black. He was not allowed to sit in the white section. And the federal court actually allowed this segregation to happen because they said that the separate treatment of people based on race was allowed as long as black Americans still had equal opportunities. So you could have white restaurants as long as you have black restaurants. You could have white railroad cars as long as you have black railroad cars. So the Supreme Court twisted the 14th Amendment's equal protection clause to allow for this racial apartheid, this racial segregation that we all know as Jim Crow. So it's amazing to see how these revolutionary amendments to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are being used and abused. Literally, it's not what they're for, but they're being abused by white Southerners in power and white Northerners in power. And then finally, the 15th Amendment. Southern states dismantled the 15th Amendment. Remember, the 15th Amendment allowed for all men, regardless of skin color, to vote. So what the Southern states did is they said, well, if African Americans could vote, we're going to create a poll tax. So in the Southern constitutions of these Southern states, many Southern states enacted poll taxes, which was voting, But if you wanted to vote in any election, you had to pay a certain fee. You had to pay money to vote. So the language in the Constitution had nothing to do with race because it was financial. You had to pay to vote. This applied to white people too. But because black codes created the environment where African Americans were legally forced to work for low wages at the discretion of former slave owners, African Americans were in poverty, like state-sponsored poverty. And the poll taxes specifically targeted them. Many of them were not allowed to afford the right to vote because they simply just did not have the money. And what's frustrating is not this impacted all Americans living in these southern states, these poll taxes, to the point where in 1942, all of the southern states using poll taxes saw only 3% of their voting age population vote in general elections. 3%. That means a very small minority of wealthy people living in these southern states had the power to elect representatives that they saw fit to rule and made them run the whole state. So poll taxes were specifically done to target African Americans to prevent them to progress and vote, but it hurt everybody. It was undemocratic. And then the other thing many of these southern states did to override the 15th Amendment was literacy tests. Southern states required their whole population, and if anyone wanted to vote, white or black, they had to take a literary test. They had to prove that they could read or write. Again, this not only impacted black Americans, but white Americans as well. So this undemocratic system was instituted to preserve this system that exploited black labor. And this was allowed because, yes, I know the 15th Amendment said you can't prevent someone from voting based off of race. But they said nothing about preventing someone to vote based off of money or literacy. So you saw these southern states just adapt and evolve. And with that said, we're getting to our conclusion, folks. We're ending this podcast to just about 2 hours. So for those here that have been listening to the whole thing or breaking it up in chunks, I want to thank you for making it this far. I know it's a lot of information, and we took a deep dive into this, but I hope it's been useful. So I'm going to sum it up for you. All right. The era of Reconstruction after the Civil War was a time of great conflict between states' rights versus federal power. And this makes sense, right? Especially after Reconstruction came as a result of a brutal war between states and the federal government. So Northern victory of the Civil War allowed for African Americans to receive federal protections. These protections were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the Freedmen's Bureau as well. Even though these rights were codified into the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution, the federal government prioritized states' rights. This is because both the North and especially the South depended on the cheap, exploitative labor of African Americans. Virtually the same power structures that existed before the Civil War were reinstituted after the Civil War. It didn't go without a fight. Republicans in the federal government tried to enforce these 3 civil rights amendments in the South with a federal military presence. African Americans funded their own schools to educate their children. African Americans were elected into Congress. White terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan or the Red Shirts lynched thousands of African Americans in response to this. You see, the white response to black advancement is a major theme in U.S. history. Southern states ruled by former Confederates and slave owners instituted black codes to recreate slavery through legal frameworks. And although there were advances with these amendments, these very same amendments that were meant to uplift and provide equity for African Americans and newly freed Americans who were formerly enslaved, these very same amendments were actually reworded, reinterpreted, and weaponized against African Americans in the 1870s. Not by the Klan, but by the federal Supreme Court. You see, the implicit biases that many white Americans, North and South, in this era were raised with and were exposed to influenced their decision making. And the power structures that existed before the Civil War still existed in, post-Civil War years. Many of those in power, virtually all of them, were white. And not knowing the African American experience in the South, not understanding what it's like, allowed for the prioritization of states' rights over federal rights. These prejudices, these biases, contributed to federal officials to turn their back against the Constitution. This was not democracy. None of this was constitutional when the Reconstruction period ended in the 1870s. It was against, right? It was against the Constitution. Nonetheless, it was widely accepted among those in power, and we saw another 100 years of a Southern society that mirrored society before the Civil War. Slavery was back, except through the 13th Amendment. Slavery through a different name, through prison. Black codes were there. Segregation, separate but equal, existed. And racial terrorism scared many African Americans away from voting in their own interests. So with these conditions created, the Civil War, despite all the military and battlefield sacrifices both sides fought and the North fought, the South won. The South was eventually victorious. And we will not see effective legal change and effective implementation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment until the Civil Rights Movement. And even beyond the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, we still see examples of the federal government not fully implementing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Many U.S. corporations to this day within the United States still rely on prison labor for their goods. By the time I'm recording this in 2021, McDonald's, Wendy's, Walmart, Starbucks, Sprint, Verizon, Victoria's Secret, Fidelity Investments, JCPenney, Avis Airlines, all of them use prison labor. According to the Left Business Observer, the federal prison industry produces 100% of all military helmets, war supplies, and other equipment. The workers supply 98% of the entire market for equipment assembly services, 93% of paints and paintbrushes, 92% of stove assembly, 46% of body armor, 36% of home appliances, 30% of headphones, microphones, and speakers, and 21% of office furniture, airplane parts, medical supplies, and much more. Prisoners are even raising seeing eye dogs for blind people. And inmates make on average 90 cents to $4 a day for this labor. This is an example of the 13th Amendment being utilized to justify prison labor rather than rehabilitation. Now, I know there's a whole different debate on this where, other side, some people use prison labor as a form of apprenticeship and it gives prisoners work to do and helps with the rehabilitation. But nonetheless, the way that it's being implemented all throughout the nation, um, we still see prison labor being utilized to support uh, corporations, right? So this is, again, a modern example of the 13th Amendment being used to uh, bring back this cheap, exploitable labor that slavery once had. Bringing it to 2021, groups like Black Lives Matter view the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, as a federal justification for why they should combat police brutality. Many of them are arguing that African Americans are not given equal treatment as white Americans by police officers. And federal courts currently still deny that. But nonetheless, it's interesting to see that the failures of Reconstruction, many of which evolved around the use, implementation, and interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, those issues are currently being brought up today, right now. And interestingly, as I record this, today, I don't know what the results of the election will be, but today Georgia is having a very important race for the Senate in Congress, right? And uh, I think it was the Democratic side. They're arguing that there's a lot of voter suppression being done, which we're talking like right 15th Amendment. Voter suppression. All people should have the right to vote no matter their race. You saw how in the era of Reconstruction, even though race may not be the explicit reason for why voter suppression is occurring or may be occurring, right? Different interpretations of it may. So whether it's economic explanations or political, right? That's that's how it was done in Reconstruction. So given Reconstruction as you heard it, I hope that you were able to identify what the College Board wants you to know. Bringing it back, bringing it back. All right? The College Board wants you to know that the Civil War and Reconstruction kind of solved the slavery and secession problem, but it left unresolved many questions about the power of the federal government and citizenship rights. This is basically, I mean, in my opinion, it's still an issue that many Americans are disagreed over. What role does the federal government have? Should the civil rights amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, be interpreted to be inclusive, or should it allow for the exclusion of American citizens? And also citizenship rights. What rights are protected? So, with that, I sincerely thank you for your gratitude and your patience for listening to this. I hope this was engaging. If not, I apologize. But I wanted to use this time to compile my notes that I've been taking over this past break to create something digestible and productive for you to listen to so you could get a better understanding of the era of Reconstruction. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a pleasant day. Remember to use history critically to better understand the world we live in today. It's always there for you. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye bye.